Welcome everyone to the Entrepreneur Speaker Series powered by Rolf and Marg Hougen. This month we're featuring Matt Douglas, who you'll see in just a moment. I'm Rick. I'm going to be running the tech side, so if you have any questions, I'm going to encourage you to type them into chat, and I will read them out for our guests. That works if you're on YouTube or if you're on Zoom. If you're on Zoom, you can see me in the screen to the very left. If you're on YouTube, you'll just have to imagine me. So without further ado, I'm going to switch over to Matt and O'Shea. And there they are. You're live, guys.
Howdy. Hey, everyone. So thank you all for joining us. As Rick said, the Entrepreneurship Speaker Series is powered by Rolf and Marg Hougen. And the goal is just to connect you with entrepreneurs in Whitehorse, in the Yukon, who are doing what you want to be doing. You might just be considering a business, or you might just be getting started. So this is a great opportunity for you to hear from people who have done it, are doing it, and then they can walk you through their process, some of the struggles they dealt with, because there are a lot of common themes. And so, as mentioned, we're here with Matt Douglas, so we'll welcome him.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us online. So we'll get started, and how it'll go is we'll have a conversation with Matt, and then if you have any questions, you can feel free to type them into the chat boxes, and then Rick will read them out, and Matt will answer, and we'll just go from there. So feel free to type them in whenever you want. And in the meantime, we'll just get started on the general gist of things. So Matt.
The general banter.
There we go.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about yourself and sort of how you came to be in Whitehorse.
Sure, yeah. So hi everyone. My name is Matt Douglas. Originally from Oakville, Ontario, a little sort of suburb outside of Toronto. Grew up there, sort of lived the standard sort of like middle class suburban life. Went to University of Guelph to get my Bachelor of Commerce in Marketing, and actually found myself with this weird unofficial minor in agricultural business, which seemingly comes up later in life. But went through university and then went right into consumer marketing for a while. And then through a whole sort of slew of different events, found myself in Whitehorse. I mean, we were involved in a few different marketing agencies. Mm-hmm. We were doing experiential marketing, which is a fancy way of saying sort of an experience or event marketing. So, you know, whether you're slinging Doritos on the side of the streets, you know, in 500 street corners around the country to line up with like Iron Man releasing or something in the movie theaters, or maybe doing a pop-up space, you know, taking over empty commercial real estate and, you know, creating an experience for like RBC or Pepsi or something like that. But then sort of through a few years, we were doing that and having a lot of fun. And at that point, you know, I'm 25 years old, pretty happy with where I am, you know, the expense account, you know, a fun car, taking clients out to Raptors games and all that sort of BS. But then fast forward a few more years, and I was at a point where, you know, we weren't really feeling as fulfilled as I think I'd like to be. Plus, at that point, I've got friends who are getting their PNG rings and they're getting their MD, and all of a sudden they're making like a bit more of an impact in their community. And that started to sort of hit me a little bit, and I was trying to figure out, you know, what could I do next? Mm-hmm. So fast forward a couple more years, the agency that I got invited to help start sold, and so I was in the middle of my earnout. And one snowy February, I found myself in Whitehorse visiting family. My sister and I actually flew up to go sort of take care of the kids for a week. So we were here in Whitehorse, and then I actually got hooked up with a local entrepreneur, Sonny Gray. Mm-hmm. He did the Entrepreneur Series talk last month. Yeah. And for 3.5 hours on this cold February day, we sat in his office, and he regaled me about entrepreneurship in the North. I mean, he talked about how there's so much opportunity, you know, there's all these miniature vacuums around with a need for people to fill them, whether it's a service or something else. He talked a lot about, you know, the support from the government and the support from the community. But where he really started to resonate with me is he started to talk about food security. And he started to sort of paint the picture of what it's like living in the North and having the 2 highways in and out for food and the impact that has. So all of a sudden I was sort of like, oh wow, okay. You know, I've visited Whitehorse before. Mm-hmm. I know it's a great place to set down roots. I know it's a really good sort of work-life balance and tons of stuff to do outside. But now there's like this really interesting opportunity that checks a lot of my boxes, for my values. I mean, I love food, eyes up here, but I love food and I love eating and cooking and all the rest of it. And so, okay, wait a second, there's this opportunity where I can get involved and help these guys build their business as they're building food projects, right? So food production and helping First Nations build food security for themselves. And so immediately it was like, boom, this is what I want to do next. And actually it's funny, so I left that meeting, it was like minus 42 degrees, I was totally underdressed, had these crappy gloves on, and I leave, and the first thing I do is I pick up my phone and I call my girlfriend, Heather, who at the time we'd only been together for 8 months or something. And I said, hey, I think we're gonna move to Whitehorse. And she says what I'm sure most people say, where is Whitehorse? Yeah. And yeah, so, and then literally almost to the day, a year later, we pack up her Jeep Compass and in the middle of winter, drive out to Whitehorse.
So you get here and you have food security as an issue that you want to tackle, and the business gears are turning. So what was the idea that you came up with, and how did you approach sort of tackling that food security issue, and what was the spark?
Yeah, so food security, I mean, even saying it, it's a weird word, right? I mean, food security, the word itself gets used over and over and over.
Totally.
And it's tricky, right? I mean, we could go eat at McDonald's every day for all of our meals and we would be technically food secure, right? I mean, there's way more to it. And what we try to really hit in on is like food sovereignty. Like, how do we take control back of our own food production, the distribution of it, the use of it? How are we reclaiming, bad food and all the rest of it? But for us, this first project that we were doing was to build an aquaponics facility. For anyone here in Whitehorse, I mean, I've chatted about it before. It's really cool. It's a really cool project. We're in it's not very new, right? Aquaponics as an idea has been done for millennia in other parts of the world, where they would have rice paddies and fish that are swimming through to basically fertilize the plants. What we were wanting to do was something that was newer over the past 2 decades, which was combining indoor controlled aquaculture with horticulture, vertically integrated, and basically use the feces from the fish to fertilize the plants and supercharge their growth.
Yeah.
So that was our first project. We said, great, this is what we want to do. We had a great partner lined up. It was going to be a big old building, like 40,000 square feet, and we were going to do 1.5 million pounds of leafy greens every single year.
And that was stuff that people could buy, obviously, in grocery stores and all that kind of thing. And I guess you have that vision. What do you start to do to implement it? And then can you maybe walk us through the timeline of sort of how you came to be where you're at now as well?
Yeah, I mean, that was and continues to be an interesting project. Sonny Gray and Joel Gates from North Star Agriculture, they started on the project 1.5 years even before I came around. And so they had found a project partner. It's actually Carcross Tagish First Nation down just south of Whitehorse. And that project was moving along. We had really good traction. And then through sort of a variety of different variables, we basically had to pull out and we had to pivot. And it was a tough decision to make, a really tough decision to make. We basically set ourselves back almost 2 years by doing that. However, it's one of those things that sometimes you have to really take a step back and figure out, is this the right move? And are you constantly seeing red flags that you're sort of brushing away from you, and sort of, we talked before about tunnel vision, right? Did we have the tunnel vision going on and we're missing some of these red flags that may otherwise have sort of pushed us off course? Yeah. Right? So we ended up pivoting from that project, and then over the past few years, we've sort of gotten involved with other food production projects. So we have a pig farm, we now have a meat distribution company, and as of most recently, we started a marketing agency for all sorts of businesses, small, medium, even NGOs and charities. But our real bread and butter with that is in the food and beverage industry, which really leans into agriculture. How can we help farmers commercialize and sort of grow their own business? And
that's mammoth. And as far as when you're looking at these red flags, just to loop back on that piece, a lot of entrepreneurs who are starting up their adventure might see it and think that they can handle that, or they have the skills to take that on and it's not too much of a worry. but at what point did you realize that you were maybe brushing away a few too many red flags?
A great question. For any entrepreneur or anyone who wants to be an entrepreneur, I mean, it's hard to see the difference between a red flag and just a problem to solve, right? I mean, entrepreneurship is constantly just creative problem solving, because if it was easy, anyone would do it. And whether that's because you're testing a new business concept or you're coming up with a new piece of technology, you know, there's a lot of problems and hurdles along the way. And so I think on one hand, yeah, it's pretty tough to sort of identify what's a hurdle and what's a red flag. But on the other hand, if you don't identify, you could get too far down the path somewhere and ultimately, you know, burn a bunch of time, a bunch of money, potentially burn out some of your employees or partners, which are, you know, not things you want to do.
Yeah. And to the tunnel vision point, looking towards the finish line and, you know, getting your product to market or launching your agency or getting to the point where you have the farm, when you zone in so much, what do you do to stay motivated when you do go through those hurdles and you do come across those challenges or problems? How do you keep your eye on the prize?
Yeah, I would say two things. One, and it's a learning that I've only really learned, I think, over the past few years, but it's really important to take yourself out of the situation and sort of what I call, get yourself to that 40,000 foot view. Because otherwise you're in the trenches and you can't see anything other than task at hand. And that's where I think you have a risk of blowing past some of these red flags. But all of a sudden when you're at this aerial view, which is obviously hypothetical, but it gives you an opportunity to see, okay, are these red flags tied together? Is there a pattern forming? Is there something bigger that we should be worried about here? And tangibly, what do I mean? Like, how do I do that? Sometimes it's just a function of turning off my phone or turning off that email account for a few days and really like taking yourself out of the situation and letting, for me, it's my subconscious, you know, I'll let it chew on something or digest and then come back with a bit of a clear head and typically can make a decision.
Do you find that some of the other people that we've had on this series have talked about the benefits of having other partners and being able to bounce those ideas off of them? And I know when you and I talked, you know, having a smaller group can sometimes make it difficult, and having a larger group, same thing, maybe too many voices. How do you tackle those problems when you come across them? Do you often do the outreach? Do you talk to your other partners, or do you try and mull it over more yourself? Or?
Yeah, well, let me first say that I'm super lucky to have like tremendous business partners here in the Yukon. I had a really amazing team of business partners back home as well when I was in the marketing space. But here in the Yukon, it's totally different, right? We have partners who are sort of similar age as myself. We have partners who are a little bit older. We have partners who are well older, and they all come from different walks of life. So we are pretty lucky in the fact that we have this great network of people who we can bounce ideas off of. We can, you know, give them shit if we need to, or they can give us shit if that needs to happen. And we're just in this position where I feel, because of the team approach, we're able to get a whole lot more done. We're able to get it done faster, and typically we're able to avoid a lot of mistakes along the way.
Going to the farm again, you come up here, and it's not necessarily something that a lot of entrepreneurs will tackle as their business idea, right? When we think entrepreneurship, we think tech or a restaurant, that kind of thing. What are some of the challenges that you found trying to get into the farming space and food sovereignty, food security space?
Farming ain't easy. It's crazy. So I grew up in Oakville, right? I went to University of Guelph. I met some really amazing people there who are third, fourth generation farmers. And through school, you know, you'd go home on a Sunday morning and you'd help them do chores. And even back then at 17, I sort of was like, okay, yeah, farming is not easy, but it is way harder than I think I ever really could have really imagined. And then take yourself out of, you know, southwestern Ontario, where you have B trains of feed and stable power and all these other things and somewhat more consistent weather, and then come up, you know, north of 60, and it's even harder, right? It's not something that I ever really thought that I'd be doing, but I can tell you this: when we're able to make a sale to a restaurant, or we get a piece of customer feedback saying that pork chop was the best pork chop that I've ever eaten, I mean, that sort of fills me and the rest of our partners up in a way that, you know, you wouldn't really get.
Yeah.
And I think what's really cool is we have a pretty supportive community here who wants to support local, right? So right now we have our meat distribution company, or like our vertically integrated meat company that we built over the past few years. And almost weekly, we're getting more and more customers without doing any advertising. We're getting more and more customers who are hearing about us word of mouth or seeing us at this restaurant or on that menu, and they just want to support local. And so we're sort of already building our business fairly fast, even though there are a lot of hurdles and a lot of challenges with doing this in the Yukon. But it's like the validation is there, right? And same thing goes for Mammoth. And I'm only one half of Mammoth, right? Richard Eden couldn't be here today. He's my co-founder. But the two of us, same sort of thing. I mean, we're able to do way more. Like, we're greater than the sum of our two parts, or whatever that silly expression is. But it's one of those things that even if we're not, let's say, going and feeding pigs that day, if we're at Mammoth and all of a sudden we're putting together a marketing plan for X farmer so that they can commercialize, or we just developed some packaging and we got them into some retailers, like, that's pretty powerful, because now we know that we're helping connect, that farmer and that amazing food, whether it be bacon or whether it be pickled vegetables. Like, it doesn't really matter. There's a lot of love and sweat and tears and energy that went into making that food product. And so now with Mammoth, we're sort of able to help that get to consumers. And while we don't get the, hey, that was an amazing pickled carrot, thanks so much, we know that we're helping that pickled carrot get to more people.
And if people do have any questions, feel free to type them into the box and Rick can read them out. But actually, building on that point, just the local piece, obviously now we're in buy local and there's a big push in light of COVID and all that stuff. What are some of the points that you make to people when they're picking up, a pig from down south, wherever it may be, end up here? How do you convince them that that's a better purchase, and what are the reasons that you use?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, O'Shea. It's challenging because from a food standpoint, over the past 30, 40 years, people's understanding and their relationship with food has totally changed. And I can tell you, growing up in the burbs, like, I had probably 15 grocery stores within 3 kilometers, and each and every one of them had 30 or 40,000 SKUs, the best looking produce, fresh meat and seafood and all of that. But you don't really understand where it comes from and how much work goes into creating that. And so when people ask, oh, why is your pork more expensive? The first thing we typically say is, well, you should be asking, why is that other pork so cheap, right? And sometimes you have the opportunity to really educate on, like, well, let us walk you through a standard pig, like a standard cycle of raising a pig for consumption, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want to get too graphic, obviously. But the model of, like, here's all the cost inputs, here's all the labor, here's all of the things that go into it, not to mention the fact that we have increased costs because of how far away we are from where we would be buying feed from, or the electricity costs to run our generators or whatever it might be, right? Typically, we find that once people have a very quick conversation or maybe read a few marketing materials at a trade show and sort of understand why it's a little bit more money, they're pretty quick to say, well, I totally get it. I appreciate what you guys are doing as farmers. I want to subscribe.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned when we were doing the pre-interview too is sort of developing the tools that farmers can take advantage of to get their product out to market. Like you said, the marketing, the website, that kind of thing. How do you convince, the farmers within the territory who may be resistant or might not have the aptitude to design a website themselves? Or how do you get them to buy into the fact that the marketing piece is important and not so much because you want to make the giant splash, but because you just want to get people to pick it up and make the first purchase and get hooked, kind of thing?
Right. A very relevant question today because, traditionally farmers who would create, whether you raise 20 turkeys or, 100 beef, up until 2 years ago when we started Yukon Born and Raised Meats, we didn't have a platform for farmers to sell their stuff, right? So if you raise 10 beef on your property in the Ibex Valley, you would be responsible for booking slaughter, figuring out how you want to process that animal, selling that, and then getting it to them, let alone any type of advertising if you need to find customers.
Yeah.
But beyond that, a lot of these farmers, they're pretty small scale, and so they don't have a problem moving whatever they produce or whatever they raise. And so what we've found is it's a combination, really. It's two things. One, it's about talking to the farmers who are looking to expand their operation. I mean, we have something like 98.5% of the food that we eat in the Yukon is imported. And there's a lot of people doing awesome things, trying to increase their own food production in order to bring that number down and, like, you know, further down and have more and more local food production. So it's talking to those people and making sure that we're putting our energy where it should be. But then it's also this government play. You know, in the Yukon, there's this sticker that you've probably seen called Yukon Grown. It's got a little fireweed on it. It's like a bluey purple color. That thing was invented like 15 or some odd years ago. No money has been put towards it really as of late, but yet these commercial farmers and farmers who are trying to be commercial, a lot of young ones too, I might add, they don't have a platform to basically build awareness for their product. So for example, if I'm a small farmer, I have 3 acres and I want to grow a bunch of lettuce. The onus is on me, the farmer, to invest in marketing materials, to build a website, to do all those things.
Yeah.
When you looked at any other jurisdiction in Canada, and there is a national, like a jurisdictional body that covers a lot of that marketing. Foodland Ontario is a big one. Buy BC is another one. Even Alaska has Alaska Grown, which has been around for like 50 years. Hipsters wear Alaska Grown t-shirts while they're drinking PBRs. Like, I'm telling you, and we don't have that here. I mean, we have it, but it needs some energy put into it in order to help those farmers who are looking to get more, so that, again, the onus is taken off them to market their stuff and really allow them to just focus on what they should be doing, which is growing food.
Yeah. Awesome. And we do have 2 questions, so we'll just get Rick to read them out one at a time, and then we can answer those too.
For sure. The first question is from Steve Metcalf over on Zoom, and he asks, what's the biggest difference in running an agency in Whitehorse versus Toronto?
Great question, Steve. Hello. I was hoping you'd ask a question. Steve Metcalf is my old business partner in Toronto. I would say the biggest difference would be that a lot of the people that we work with here in Whitehorse, and even throughout Yukon, they probably haven't worked with an agency before. And so what we find is, for, I don't know what the number is, maybe half of the people that we're chatting with or that we're doing work for, they don't have that experience with like a client agency relationship. So the process, the pricing, the expectations, all that stuff is typically like new to them. And sometimes that's a good thing because we have carte blanche and we can sort of walk them through how we do things and how that is the better way of sort of skinning that cat. Other times it can be a bit challenging because you're chatting with someone who maybe their whole relationship with advertising was calling up their Yellow Pages rep and just asking their Yellow Pages rep to make that change on the website or to put this poster together. So it can be challenging. And on the contrary, for everyone that we worked with in Toronto, I can't really think of one client that we ever worked with that had never worked with an agency, or at least the individual, like our actual client, hasn't worked with an agency before. So extra effort for sure, extra time we have to bake into programs, but ultimately we are pretty happy with the results because they've never really grown, extended their team before, so they're letting go of the reins, and that's not easy. I mean, there's a lot of trust building that has to happen.
What was the other one?
So the next question I got is from Lana Selby, who I guess has my cell phone number because she texted the question to me. She asks, how do you find the right people to build a marketing agency? Is it hard?
It's not easy, Lana. It is not easy. So when Richard and I started, it's sort of a weird story, but we sort of met by happenstance. It was like this weird blind date thing. It was also the day before Valentine's Day, which was kind of cute. But basically, I mean, we built that agency because we saw a need and call it a gap in the market, right? There were some really amazing shops, and still are some amazing shops in town that do more communication work. They do a lot of government contracts. And then there were a lot of contractors working out of Northlight and stuff. But there wasn't anyone in the middle. There wasn't anyone to talk with startups or food businesses or farmers or even medium-sized businesses. And so Richard and I sort of had a lot of discussions in the beginnings of our sort of, hey, we have this crazy idea, and sort of said, well, how are we going to build a team, right? Because building a team in Whitehorse, I mean, the talent pool is not very big here. It's not very easy to get people to move up here, right? Although I will say that the people that do move up here are the people that actually love being in this type of an environment, right? Slightly smaller town, even though we have all the amenities, but a lot of outdoor sports and access to all that outdoor stuff.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Richard and I sort of made the decision from the very beginning that we didn't want to have a business model that relied on contractors, right? There's been some history in the past here in Whitehorse where there have been teams that would plus up and plus down when they had a contract or when there wasn't a contract. And it's just hard to retain staff that way. And so what we decided was everyone that we're going to have on our team is going to be a full-time employee. They're going to live here in Whitehorse or somewhere in the Yukon, and they're going to be like a real member of the team.
Mm-hmm.
What we found though, Lana, is when we would put a job posting up for project manager or senior graphic designer or digital comms, at that moment, we typically wouldn't get what we're looking for. And so we had to change our approach a little bit, which I'm sure other startups here in town have had to do. And instead of finding the person for the role, we actually find the person for the company, and we build a role around the person. And so, you know, we're almost 2 years old now, and we've been pretty lucky. I mean, and we're a bit of a weird company. Like, we're pretty silly at the office. I've got this big mouth Billy Bass who sings every time we walk into the office. Yeah. But we work really hard, right? And I think that's part of what Steve Metcalf drilled into me being a partner of his and being in Toronto is it's always go, go, go. You can play hard and have a lot of fun, but you got to GSD, right? What my mom used to say, get shit done.
Yeah.
And so to find the right people is a very important piece. But yeah, we've been pretty successful sort of finding the person and then building the role. Because also, we're a marketing agency. We do business development, we do creative, we do, you know, the actual marketing campaigns and graphic design and all that stuff, social media. But if we have someone on our team who comes in and can do crazy tech with Raspberry Pis and all sorts of things, I'm going to go out and I'm going to find a client who needs some of that work, and all of a sudden that person is now busy 40 hours a week.
I like that you mentioned the go, go, go piece because I think the idea around a lot of the marketing spaces in Toronto is go, 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 and there's not so much that work-life balance, although there is the work hard, play hard. It's play hard for, 4 hours a day and then work the rest. How do you incorporate that here? And maybe the people who are looking to work at Mammoth and the entrepreneurs that are starting up, how do you reinforce that the work-life balance piece is important? Or not maybe?
It's not easy. It is certainly important, and I've been learning over the past probably 6 months that it's increasingly important to sort of have your finger on the pulse, so to speak, and like figure out what it is you as a person, me as an entrepreneur, needs in order to have that balance, right? Especially because we have multiple projects, it can be really hard, right? And luckily I have someone like Heather in my life who can sort of point at me and say like, you need to turn off your phone and go out for a walk, right? And so I'll say, you're right. And I'll grab Edward Bauer and Emma Watson, our 2 dogs, and we'll go out for a hike right behind our house. I mean, we're lucky, everyone in Whitehorse, you can walk out your front step and you're like in the middle of nowhere. And basically, you just have to prioritize it. And I think as well, when you're an entrepreneur, if you have the sort of ability to prioritize it, you can make it work anytime you want. I mean, today, because our daylight is getting, certainly less and less, at 1 o'clock I went and I walked the dogs for an hour because I knew that I was going to be here later in the afternoon. The dogs hadn't been out for 2 or 3 days, and I just needed a bit of a mental break, right? The go, go, go part, it's a shift because all of my business partners are very energetic and very dedicated, and my team is also dedicated. But I need to be reminded a few times a week, sometimes of like, that might be an unfair expectation to put on a team member. And I think over the past year and a half with Mammoth specifically, it's worked. I might think to myself, okay, even though it's 4 o'clock on Friday, I have all these things I need to get done, and so I expect my team to do that. When really it should be the opposite of, okay, hold on a second, let's see what the team needs, and then how do we work backwards?
Do you think that the people who you deal with and your clients are also more understanding of the need for work-life balance and their deadlines and stuff like that too?
I mean, Rick nailed it. There is a Yukon time here for sure. Part of working with clients who haven't worked with agencies before, sometimes they don't really understand timelines and, true deadlines and, what it means that if you are 3 weeks late with your deadline, that doesn't just, move it back 3 weeks, that might move it back 6 weeks because of the way that we're project managing our queue of work. But I think in general, people are pretty understanding. I mean, especially with COVID-19, there's been a lot of, delays and things that have been a little slower to come around. And we also have clients who are like, Matt, I know we were supposed to meet today, but we just got a dump of snow and I'm going to go hit SEMA because I haven't been in 2 weeks. Like, that's cool to be on the receiving end. And then it also gives me license to sort of do the same with my team. Like, oh, it hasn't been sunny for 5 days and the sun's out. Everyone, I know it's 1 o'clock, but you should go home.
Yeah.
Go do something.
Awesome. I want to jump back to one thing you said about just the food insecurity and the food sovereignty piece, and you said that 98.5% of our food is imported, and then you said there are a lot of young entrepreneurs taking on the fight to change that. Can you expand on, because you're also one of them, what do you think it's going to take for more entrepreneurs to get involved in that space to bring that amount of imported food down?
A good question, and also a very relevant one as we go into a political season here in the Yukon. It's tough because there's a whole bunch. There's a whole list. We need access to capital, not just $20,000 grants. We need access to real capital to build. In the food space, it's always about scale and volume. And if you have, I'll use an example from Coldacre. One shipping container that you're growing basil in, like, that's great and you're showing validity, but to build a business, like, we should be daisy chaining 10 of those together or taking over an entire warehouse. And the only way you can do that is either to set those entrepreneurs up with some access to capital, low interest loans, whatever. That's, I think, number one. Number two, there needs to be less bureaucratic stuff to jump through. And I'll use the example of aquaponics because we experienced this ourselves. There's a fish farm moratorium in the Yukon. You can't open up a fish farm. Sure. We wanted to open up an aquaponics facility, and we actually got an exemption for fish farming, but we couldn't get our development permit for our land use, because there's nothing in the bylaws that speaks to aquaponics. So the discretionary use permit, yes, you can have hydroponics, or yes, with the moratorium exemption, you can do fish farming, but you can't do both. And I mean, aquaponics, like I said before, it's not that crazy. I mean, there's facilities being built all over Canada, all over the world. And as each few years goes by, those facilities are going bigger and bigger and bigger. But yet we can't build one here because we haven't, our bylaws haven't been changed in 20 years. So I think, proper cooperation with the appropriate political parties and, bureaucrats is important. And that's all new to me because I'm from the private sector before moving here. So being told to stop because you didn't fit into this box is not something that I'm really used to. And I think the last piece is training and capacity, right? If you're in school here, like as a high school student, and you want to learn how to farm, there's no resource for you. Like, there's Kids on the Farm, which is like a program for elementary kids. And I'm sure you could call up a farmer and say, hey, do you want me to work for a summer? But there's no real education. And I'm not suggesting that Yukon University is just going to create an agriculture business program or ag science or something. But there doesn't really seem to be a platform for training capacity, right? So how do we get some of these people to know that farming is not just an important trade or an important thing, but it's also something that, if done right, you can make some money at and probably feel pretty good about too.
Yeah. Awesome. So we do have 2 more questions. So Rick, take it away.
Yeah, I'm going to read out Ann Bowen's question first. She asks, what are the best mediums to market yourself or the food products that you're working with? How do you reach Yukoners? We're a unique bunch.
Yeah, that is certainly true. It's so funny, we talk often at Mammoth about, where to put your money for marketing campaigns. And I'll tell you, it's totally different. And in Toronto, I wasn't doing traditional marketing, right? I mean, we would have a social media element of what we're doing, but we would typically work with a partner agency on that. So I had a lot of learning to do when I came up here, and luckily Richard is so good at a lot of that stuff. But it's different here, with the Yukon population of 40 some odd thousand people, you actually don't really target on Facebook the way you would target down south, right? So if you have $10 a day to hit on social media, on Facebook specifically, to promote whatever your ad is, like that actually goes quite far. Same thing, we don't really have digital marketing here the way that you would have like digital signage down south on almost anything that had a front face on it. We have something like 20 or 30 digital TV screens throughout the Yukon with typically the same ads that are on in the Air North, sort of North of Ordinary magazine.
Yeah.
But that's it. And so I think what we try to do is, we cater to people's specific needs, right? So if you're selling something just at the farmer's market, we're going to build a campaign that's just going to hit those people in advance of them going to the farmer's market. But it's actually more traditional up here than you would expect, right? It's how do we talk to them at the grocery store? The radio, it's very expensive up here, relatively speaking, but everyone listens to the radio. We have a few radio stations and people love it. It's on job sites. People aren't really using Spotify and Apple Music the same way that they are down south, and so those mediums typically, they still work.
And what was the other one?
Cool. The other one, Erin Legault is just looking for a clarification. She's asking, does the name of the best company you've ever worked with rhyme with Fondering Wisen?
It might, yeah. Aaron's referencing one of our partners in Yukon Born and Raised Meats, Luke Legault, who a lot of you know. He was on the Entrepreneur Series as well.
Yep.
It does rhyme with that, Aaron. Yeah, no, that's really good. It's crazy though, and you want to talk about work-life balance. Luke has been really, really empowering for me to sort of remind me the importance sometimes of that priority management, right? I don't know how he does it. He's a new dad too, which is really exciting, and he's been able to prioritize and make that work for their family. But what's really cool about having someone like, again, Luke at the table is it's that other perspective, right? Tyler Dahl from GP Distributing is another partner in Yukon Born and Raised Meats, and he's like all outdoors. Like, how do we do more things outside? And I think they call them sled heads, where the rap on the snowmobiles. Yeah. But him and I went and bought split boards a few weeks ago because the concept of being out in the mountains, out of cell service, don't worry, we'll have a beacon, Heather, is really exciting. And I think same thing, having those partners around you to influence you, not just in business and what you're doing on the day-to-day, but also like outside of it, it's pretty powerful.
Great. And we do have another question.
Yeah, this is a comment actually. Ann Bowen wanted to add on to your comment about farm training. To point out that YG Education Post-Secondary and Labor Market, their Staffing Up program has supported many farmers this year who are able to hire students and workers and pay them $20 an hour.
Cool, yeah, that's the Top Up program, I think, right? Yeah, so
yeah.
That's pretty cool, and you're totally right. And I'm not very familiar on how many people access that.
Yeah, but actually on that, because you mentioned, the growing basil, for example, and you have it in a container, and then ideally you can kind of scale it up. Is there a point where there's not enough demand because we are still a fairly small jurisdiction, or do you still see a place where you can just start hacking in more and more into that 98.5 and bring that way down?
You got to grow a lot of basil to feed 40,000 people, and not everyone eats basil or whatever, but we're still 40,000 people. And it's not just, the standard consumer market, but it's also what are we feeding at the jails? What are we feeding at the hospital? What are we feeding at the continuing care facilities for all the seniors? So I think there's a lot of different channels. Should there be even bigger scale that we sort of go above and beyond what we can feed in the Yukon, we've got 800,000 people in Alaska right there. And part of our aquaponics project was looking into how do we export into Alaska produce. Canor actually helped fund that. They've been tremendous in helping us with a lot of our projects. But what was really amazing is when we were in Alaska and we were doing this feasibility study, they were like, no one has ever asked us these questions. We were at the FDA and they're like, you want to export produce from the Yukon like into Anchorage? And we're like, yeah, I know, it's crazy. But there's captive markets there. Like there are a lot of people with a lot of disposable money, and Alaska has the same problem that the Yukon does. Instead of the food coming up on a highway, it comes up on the Alaska Marine Highway in big shipping containers on big, like, shipping boats, tankers or whatever they're called. And those shipping containers fall off the boats when bad storms. Bad storms keep them at port for a while, and so they literally can't come in. They have a lot of the same problems. And then as well, backhaul opportunities.
Yeah.
Right? So all these trucks that are coming up bringing us food and materials and supplies and wares to sell in our retail stores, they go back empty. And so something that we've been looking at a lot is how do we tap into those empty trucks to then hit some of the major city centers down northern British Columbia and northern Alberta.
It's amazing to think of all the different pieces that go into something as simple as food, right? And getting it to reach more people. As you're growing as an entrepreneur and you've been doing it for a while, you come to a new hurdle, or how do you look at all those steps, or is it just kind of do it until you get there and then figure it out once that happens, kind of thing?
I think there's a healthy balance, right? And I also think that coming here to the Yukon and working with some of my partners has sort of taught me to get a little bit more on we just got to do it. You got to jump in. For the first year and a half I was here, everything needed a plan, and every plan needed to be vetted, and you need to come up with 3 different sort of backup plans in case any of these variables happen or whatever. And that doesn't always work, right? Especially as an entrepreneur, you basically always want to be first to market, whether that be with a decision on you're changing your pricing or just the general concept.
Yeah.
And so I think there's been certainly a bit of a balance. And actually, Dev Herbert, one of our other partners in Yukon Born and Raised Meats, he's that attitude of like, just go get it done, right? And so when we were starting up at the fireweed market 2 years ago, I didn't want to start at the market because we didn't have a booth, we didn't have signage, we didn't have all the things that in my mind we needed to have.
Yeah.
He's like, why would you spend all this time planning it out? Why don't you go and open up at the market? And then as you're doing, maybe $1,000 or $2,000 in sales, you're also learning those lessons. So you're capturing that revenue while also identifying what that sign should look like, how big your booth should be, whatever. And I hated him for pushing me into that. I was so uncomfortable, but it pushed me out of my comfort zone a little bit. And yeah, we hit like $1,800 in sales, and we had crappy signage from Staples and like fluorescent neon starburst signs with Sharpie, but it worked. And then we were able to go away and then sort of retool a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On that too, just sort of the idea of just trying it and stretching outside your comfort zone. We mentioned during the pre-interview, and you brought up the fake it till you make it, and kind of just, it'll happen.
Yeah.
Do you still feel that? And then if so, at what point do you think you won't feel that?
Yeah, that was a fun conversation. I mean, whether I think you're an entrepreneur or a salesperson, or really even sometimes just leading people in general, I think that there's always this element of fake it till you make it. And maybe not, maybe I'm just sort of an anomaly that way, and that there's a lot of BS coming out, but there's a lot of new situations, and literally you typically just have to jump in and figure it out as you go. I can tell you, and I think this is sort of the pre-interview question that we were talking about, when you're constantly faking it till you make it and figuring it out as you go, I mean, personally, I would suffer some anxiety from that. How do you constantly do that? And then, is that real solid ground you're standing on when you're maybe making a play to do this or to expand into that?
Totally.
And then when I was doing some more digging and talking with my network, it's more of an imposter syndrome thing, which I didn't really know what it was. I'm sure a lot of you probably know about it, but it's just this concept of you don't really feel like you are yourself doing those things because you've never done those things before.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it still is weird sometimes. I mean, I'll find myself, in a boardroom talking to one of our ministers about something and think to myself, like, what am I doing here? But then typically, the switch flicks, and then, you sort of go back into it.
And we do have a question, and then I'd like to touch on the politician point after too.
Cool, yeah. The next question we have is from Alana Monica, and she asks, if you find a way to market food to Alaska, can you also help with our other local products being sold there as well? She says, I know food is a big market, but there isn't a lot of help for local artists and crafters starting their businesses.
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, we're working with clients right now and have been over the past, I want to say 8 months or so, different food businesses and helping them get their product outside of the Yukon. It's not easy. I mean, there's a lot of regulatory things that have to be done from a packaging standpoint, from a distribution standpoint, and when we're going into the US, there's a lot of information that has to be done about actual tariffs, and it gets ugly.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've been pretty successful as of late helping some clients do that. And if anyone is interested, not that this is a shameless plug, but please reach out because we love working on food and beverage projects. And our whole model is that with our own projects, we're getting food into these other areas. And so all of those lessons that we're learning, we're more than happy to share with other businesses because, there is only 40,000 people here. And I think maybe more importantly, out of that 40,000 people, there's typically only maybe the top third or top half who can maybe even afford to buy some of this local product because at the current scale, it's a little bit more money. So then how do you make sure that you're still focusing on producing and increasing your capacity? And typically that means getting your product out to other markets.
Awesome. We are getting close to 5, so 2 more questions, and then if there's any last minute ones online there. But one of them is, you mentioned the example of just talking to politicians and being that close. The aquaponics point, it makes me think up here we are very lucky in that we are far closer to those decision makers and the people who can play a part in changing that policy. Is it exciting to be in a jurisdiction where what you're doing really could be the next step in the frontier for farming or for different entrepreneurial pursuits?
Totally. And to speak on the politician piece, I mean, people warned me like, oh yeah, you see your MLA or whatever at the grocery store or whatever. It's crazy. I mean, I see politicians everywhere I go. At the bank, I mean, I could tell you the license plate of Range's black F-150 if we wanted. It's pretty wild. But I think what's really exciting is, as much as that might be a bit of a nightmare for some of those ministers dealing with some tough problems, it definitely, I think, gives us a potentially unfair advantage in the Yukon as we try to get some of these projects pushed forward. Because if I was doing this down somewhere in Southern Ontario, you need to have huge money or come from, a blue chip family in order to rub shoulders in those circles. Yeah.
Great. And I guess we can ask the last question to kind of wrap it all up. So if there's one piece of wisdom that you can share with people who are watching who might be just wondering whether or not they want to make the jump, or they're in it and maybe feeling a little bit, they're having a tough time, what would you tell them as a little pearl of wisdom maybe?
I would just say, know yourself. Be yourself. If you have a good idea, you have to try it. Another partner of mine back in Toronto, his whole thing was you have to try it, right? Because if you don't try it, you'll never know. And whether that's trying a different type of clothing that you think will look good on you, or whether that's taking a big swing on a business idea, there's ways to scale your idea and test the concept to make sure it's valid, and get proof of concept. But just be yourself and try, because if you don't try, you'll never know.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Matt. Thank you for joining us, and thank you all for joining us as well. If you have any entrepreneurs that you think might be good for the Entrepreneurship Speaker Series, you can feel free to let us know on the chat, or you can reach out to us at Northlight. And in the meantime, enjoy your entrepreneurial pursuits. Thank you all, and thank you again, Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Join us again next month. See you then. Bye.